Claire had learned over 6 years of Christmas dinners that Margaret set the table the way she set expectations, precisely, deliberately, with everything in its assigned place. The good china came out, the linen napkins, the centerpiece of pine cones and white candles that Margaret had been reusing since before David was born. Claire had stopped offering to bring anything after the second year, when her contribution, a cranberry tart she'd spent 2 hours on, was accepted with a smile and quietly moved to the sideboard, where it stayed untouched behind the gravy boat. She had learned to read the room. What she hadn't learned, or perhaps had chosen not to, was how to disappear inside it. It happened between the turkey and the stuffing, just as the thumbnail of the moment would later replay in her mind. Margaret was serving, which she always insisted on doing herself, moving around the table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had choreographed this scene 100 times. The conversation had been ordinary, David's brother talking about his renovation, his wife nodding at appropriate intervals. The children excused early, which was a mercy. Margaret set a plate in front of Claire and then, without looking up, said the number, her salary. The exact figure, said it the way you might announce the weather. Informational, almost generous in its specificity. "I was reading about salaries in your field," Margaret said, settling back into her chair. "Interesting that they pay that range. I always assumed it was more." The table shifted, not physically, but Claire felt it, the subtle realignment of everyone deciding how to respond or whether to. She looked at David. He was looking at his plate. She looked at Margaret, who was cutting her turkey with complete composure. Claire put down her fork, picked up her napkin, wiped her mouth, set the napkin back in her lap with both hands, smoothing it flat, which gave her approximately 4 seconds to decide who she was going to be at this table. Then she said quietly, and without particular emphasis, "I'd be careful about what you find online. My actual number would make this dinner awkward." She picked her fork back up. Margaret's chair scraped, not dramatically, just the small involuntary movement of a person who has reached for something solid and found air. David looked up. Claire didn't look at him. She asked his brother a question about the renovation, something about tile, and the conversation moved, the way conversations do when someone decides to let them. The meal continued. The candles burned. The cranberry sauce was passed twice. Nothing was said about it again. That was the thing about Margaret's method. It relied on the other person flinching, on a defensive correction, or an embarrassed laugh, or a quiet retreat into the remaining courses. It relied on Claire being the kind of woman who needed the table's approval. Claire had stopped needing that somewhere around year 3. What she had said was true. The number Margaret had found online, outdated, from a salary aggregator that hadn't been updated since before Claire's last 2 promotions, was less than half of what Claire actually earned. Not because Claire had sought advancement aggressively, but because the work had compelled it. A regional director at 38, a team of 22, a portfolio that, if Margaret had Googled more carefully, would have appeared in 3 industry publications in the past 18 months. She had never mentioned it at these dinners. There had never seemed to be a reason. She had a husband who knew. A life that didn't require Margaret's acknowledgement to be real. The consequence arrived 11 days later, and Claire had nothing to do with it. Margaret sat on the board of a local charitable foundation, a position she held with visible pride and brought up with some regularity. The foundation had recently begun a partnership with a regional development firm. The development firm's primary investor relations contact was a woman named Sandra, who had worked under Claire for 4 years and credited her, publicly, with everything she knew about sustainable funding strategy. Sandra called Claire on a Tuesday, not knowing any of this, simply because Claire was Claire and the foundation needed a consultant to restructure its donor acquisition model. Claire said she'd think about it. She did think about it, genuinely, without drama, without any particular awareness of symmetry. The work was interesting. The scope was right. She took the engagement. She met Margaret at the foundation's January board dinner. 6 weeks later, in a professional context where Claire was introduced as the lead consultant by the foundation's executive director. Margaret had been told, presumably. She hadn't connected it. The moment of recognition was quiet, a slight pause, a recalibration behind the eyes. Claire shook her hand the way she shook everyone's hand, warmly, professionally, without anything extra in it. She had not arranged this. She did not feel triumphant. She felt, if anything, tired, in the particular way you feel tired when something you already knew simply becomes visible to someone else. She drove home that night in the dark, the heater on low, and thought about the cranberry tart, how she'd made it from scratch, how it had sat behind the gravy boat all evening, untouched, perfectly good. She didn't feel angry about it anymore. She mostly just thought, some things take a while to be tasted. She turned onto their street. The house lights were on. David had left the porch light on for her. She sat in the car for a moment before going in. Then she went in.